July 21st, 2012. Lincoln, Nebraska. At 9:47 p.m., security cameras at a small cafe called Coffee Haven captured Amber Callahan, a 27-year-old accountant, walking out with a man named Mark Leland. They smiled, exchanged a few quiet words, and disappeared into the warm Nebraska night. The next morning, Amber's silver Toyota Corolla was found abandoned in the Walmart parking lot. Her purse, phone, and car keys were still inside, untouched, as if she'd planned to return any minute. But she never did. Within days, Lincoln's calm routine shattered. Hundreds joined search parties, flyers papered every streetlight, and a mother's voice echoed through newsrooms begging for her daughter's return. Weeks turned into months, then years. No trace, no closure, just an empty car baking in the summer heat, and two names the city couldn't forget. 8 years later, a young investigator reopened the case, and what he uncovered would shake Nebraska to its core. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to follow every cold case we uncover, because sometimes the ones who disappear are closer than we think. On the surface, it looked like any other summer day in Lincoln, Nebraska. Sunlight pressed down on the tidy lawns and tree-lined avenues, the kind of steady golden light that made the Garden Meadows apartment complex seem almost tranquil. For Amber Callahan, that sense of normalcy was both comfort and cage. 27 years old, a single mother to a 5-year-old boy, she moved through her routine with quiet precision. Up before dawn, coaxing her son out of sleep, pouring cereal, waiting for coffee to drip into her chipped green mug. She'd check her phone, scan her email, and usher her little boy to daycare with a weary smile, all before 8 o'clock. Most days, Amber's world was ruled by order and repetition. She'd slip into the glass doors of Platt Financial, her quiet presence barely registering among the morning bustle of keyboards and copiers. Co-workers described her as dependable, invisible in the best possible way. Lunch was always alone, eaten in her car with the radio on low. It was a small, safe existence, a life measured out in paper receipts, bedtime stories, and the pale glow of streetlights through curtained windows. In the aftershocks of her drawn-out divorce, Amber told herself this was enough. But even quiet lives collect storms. That Friday, the rhythm broke. The office was slow, clients gone by mid-afternoon, so Amber clocked out early, letting the late July sun catch her by surprise. She debated going straight home, but something restless tugged at her. Maybe the sudden hush of the office, maybe the old ache in her chest that reminded her she was still only halfway healed. On a whim, she drove toward downtown, winding up at a little place called Coffee Haven, tucked beside a barber shop and a shuttered video store. Inside, the cool air was laced with the smell of espresso and cinnamon. Amber found a corner seat, glancing around until her eyes landed on Mark Leland. He was already waiting, a cup cradled in his large, steady hands, his expression open and familiar. Mark was older by a decade, a former co-worker from her first year at Platt. He'd always seemed a bit out of place, charming, but with a restlessness that showed at the edges. They hadn't spoken in months, but he'd texted the day before, asking if she wanted to catch up. Maybe, Amber thought, she needed a reminder that her world could still hold new beginnings. They sat by the window, bathed in the last of the evening sun. From across the street, they must have looked like any pair of friends, sharing secrets and laughter, heads bent together over coffee. But beneath the easy conversation, currents ran deep. Mark talked about his own fractured marriage, how he longed to disappear, to start fresh somewhere no one knew his name. Amber listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes twisting the ring she no longer wore on her left hand. To the other customers, it was just another Friday. But for Amber, it felt like a door cracking open, letting in the possibility of change or danger, or maybe both. As the sky darkened, the city shifted into weekend mode, car headlights blinking on, the air cooling, people streaming out of nearby bars. Around 9, Amber and Mark rose from their table. A waitress would later recall their laughter as they headed outside, the clink of keys, the faint brush of Mark's hand on Amber's back as they left. Some would say they seemed close, others would say they looked lost, but nobody paid much attention as they disappeared into the parking lot. That was the last anyone would see of Amber Callahan. The next morning, her silver Toyota Corolla was discovered abandoned in the Walmart lot. Doors locked, her purse, phone, and keys left inside. The car sat in the soft heat of a Nebraska dawn, unnoticed for hours, just another vehicle among hundreds. But Amber was gone. The city hadn't noticed her absence yet. Life moved on, quiet as ever. But in the silence that followed, a question hung in the air, as heavy and unspoken as the summer storm building far off to the west. What really happened that night? What shadow had slipped into Amber Callahan's carefully ordered world and stolen her away, leaving nothing behind but a mystery that would haunt Lincoln for years to come? Lincoln, Nebraska, was a city that wore its calm like a badge of honor. Streets unfurled in neat, predictable grids, shaded by maple trees and marked by tidy front yards. It was the sort of place where the old rules still seemed to hold, where neighbors offered gentle waves from driveways, where porch lights were left on more out of habit than fear, and where, most evenings, the only real disturbance came from cicadas humming in the summer dusk. Amber Callahan had always blended seamlessly into this landscape. Her childhood had been spent on these very streets, riding her bike past the courthouse, sharing milkshakes with her sister in the park, catching fireflies in jars on muggy July nights. The city had changed little over the years, and so had Amber, at least on the surface. To those who knew her, she was reliable, steady as clockwork, modest, someone you could trust with a house key or a whispered secret. Yet, beneath the quiet exterior, Amber was a woman fighting invisible battles. She was 27, her brown hair often swept back in a loose ponytail, eyes tired but still sharp with hope. The last 2 years had chipped away at her, first with the slow collapse of her marriage, then the constant tug-of-war over custody of her son. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to pull her under, moments when she pressed her palm to the glass of her apartment window and whispered, "I just want to breathe again." But even as she struggled, she held fiercely to her routine, believing that order was a shield against chaos. Her 5-year-old son was the anchor that kept her steady. Every night, after the dishes were done and the toys packed away, she would kneel beside his bed, smoothing his hair and telling him stories. For him, she had learned to swallow her sorrow, to paint her smile on day after day. The world saw a single mother getting by, but Amber's closest friend saw something braver, a woman who refused to let heartbreak define her. Mark Leland was another story. At 38, he was taller than most men in town, his shoulders broad, his jaw flecked with perpetual stubble that gave him an air of easy ruggedness. Mark's life had never moved in straight lines. He was a mechanical engineer by trade, the sort of man who could fix a broken alternator with nothing but a screwdriver and a scrap of wire. Friends described him as charming, even magnetic, someone who could turn a simple greeting into a conversation that lasted hours. But those who looked closer saw the cracks. Mark's marriage was a patchwork of old resentments and unspoken regrets. He'd spent the last year living apart from his wife and their 2 children, shuttling between a rented room and late-night drives that took him nowhere. To some, he confided his secret longing to disappear, to start fresh somewhere his past couldn't find him. "I dream about it sometimes," he'd admit over beers with old friends. "Just packing a bag and leaving it all behind. You ever wonder what would happen if you really tried?" In a city like Lincoln, secrets traveled slowly, but they never truly vanished. Rumors drifted in the air, about Amber's messy divorce, about Mark's estrangement, about the quiet desperation that sometimes shadows even the brightest, safest places. Most people ignored these whispers. After all, Lincoln was a city that clung to its innocence, a city where trouble was supposed to be something that happened elsewhere. But even here, beneath the safe veneer, darkness waited. The streets that seemed so tranquil in the light could change at night. Shadows stretching longer, familiar places taking on an uneasy edge. There were alleys behind the old movie theater, gravel roads winding past fields that stretched into nothingness, quiet corners where you could vanish without a trace if you wanted to, or if someone wanted you gone. It was in these spaces, tucked between the ordinary and the unknown, that Amber and Mark's story took root. Neither of them could have guessed, on that warm July night, that the decisions they made would ripple outward, unsettling the calm that Lincoln prized so dearly. To the outside world, they were just 2 more faces in the crowd, their private pain invisible, their desires too tangled for anyone to untangle. But fate, that silent architect, was already laying out its trap, stringing together chance encounters and lonely dreams into something much larger than either of them could see. In the weeks before their disappearance, there were small signs that something was shifting. Amber started arriving at work earlier, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for a way out. Mark grew quieter, his laughter less frequent, his evenings spent lingering in empty parking lots. Both carried burdens that weighed heavier as the summer grew hotter, burdens they could no longer carry alone. Lincoln, for all its peaceful charm, had never been immune to tragedy. But as July moved toward its end, and the long shadows of evening crept across the city, no one could have imagined that 2 lives would slip so suddenly from the fabric of the everyday, vanishing into thin air, leaving nothing but questions, and a silence deeper than any the city had known before. The evening of July 21st, 2012, crept over Lincoln with a hush, as if the city itself sensed something was about to break. The sky faded from blue to amber, dusk settling over quiet streets, and the faint glow of porch lights beginning to pierce the darkness. For most residents, it was an unremarkable Saturday, marked by cookouts, laughter from open windows, and the rhythmic sweep of sprinklers. For Amber Callahan, it was a night that would fracture her world and leave a city haunted by the shadows she left behind. The day had unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Amber left work earlier than usual, a decision she made on impulse, barely noticed by her colleagues as she slipped out the door. She stopped by her apartment only briefly, long enough to change her clothes and pack a snack for her son, whom she dropped off at her mother's house for the night. She lingered in the driveway, looking back at the front window, where her little boy's face pressed against the glass, waving with a sleepy grin. It was a detail Janet Callahan would replay in her mind for years. The last time she saw her daughter, the soft click of car doors, the smile that didn't quite reach Amber's eyes. Amber texted her best friend before leaving, fingers trembling just a little. "I'm going to talk to Mark tonight. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." It was a message that would later become a lifeline for detectives, a cryptic hint at intentions that would remain forever unclear. But for Amber, it was an act of hope, a step towards something new, or maybe just a desperate grasp at relief. She drove to Coffee Haven, the familiar hum of her Corolla's engine almost soothing beneath the thumping of her heart. The cafe's windows glowed yellow against the deepening dusk, and inside Mark Leland waited, his gaze steady but distant as she approached. The security cameras caught them together, Amber's posture guarded but trusting, Mark's hands in his jacket pockets as they exchanged quiet words. At 9:47 p.m., the footage showed them stepping out together, their silhouettes melting into the night. They walked to Mark's truck, a battered silver Ford F-150 parked beneath a flickering street lamp. Witnesses later struggled to recall details. Some remembered seeing them drive away. Others insisted they lingered in the lot, talking in low voices. But no one noticed when the truck finally pulled onto the street and vanished into the gentle churn of weekend traffic. At 10:23 p.m., Amber's phone signal vanished near Highway 77, just south of the city. There was no frantic call, no trace of struggle, just sudden, chilling silence. Mark's phone would blink off moments later, lost to the same dark stretch of road. The night pressed on, indifferent, swallowing up two lives as if they had never existed at all. Morning brought no relief, only confusion. Amber's mother grew anxious when her daughter failed to respond to texts and calls, but told herself not to worry. She busied herself with chores, expecting Amber to appear by noon to pick up her son. But noon came and went. By afternoon, anxiety sharpened into dread. Janet drove the familiar route to Amber's apartment, scanning every driveway and street, the tension in her chest tightening with every unanswered ring. It was not until early evening that a Walmart employee, noticing a silver sedan sitting alone at the edge of the sprawling lot, called it in. The car was unlocked, its interior neat. Amber's purse rested on the passenger seat. Her phone and keys were tucked inside, as if she'd meant to return any minute. The engine was cold. The parking lot, teeming with weekend shoppers, had offered her neither shelter nor witness. The discovery set off a chain reaction. When Amber failed to appear at daycare the following morning, her mother could wait no longer. She dialed 911 with trembling hands, her voice tight with fear. Almost simultaneously, Mark's family reported him missing, unable to reach him since the previous night. Police arrived to find little to go on, no signs of violence, no witnesses, no immediate leads. The investigation began with methodical urgency. Detectives traced the couple's steps, reviewing security footage, interviewing employees, canvassing the area for anyone who might have seen the pair after leaving Coffee Haven. The footage confirmed their departure together, but yielded no hints of distress or haste. The trail ended with the dead signal near the highway, a ghostly interruption in an otherwise routine night. Speculation bloomed in the void. Had they run away together, as some suggested? Had something more sinister occurred along that lonely road? Each theory seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Friends described Amber as cautious, unlikely to leave her child or mother without warning. Mark's loved ones insisted he was restless, but never reckless. yet both were gone, as if the earth itself had opened to swallow them whole. The days dragged on, hope unraveling into suspicion and rumor. Amber's car was dusted for prints, Mark's bank accounts monitored, their digital lives picked apart for clues. But there was nothing. No withdrawals, no tickets, no cryptic notes, no hint of plans made in secret. It was as though, for one night, two ordinary people had slipped between the cracks of reality, leaving only silence and unanswered prayers in their wake. Lincoln, a city unaccustomed to such mysteries, found itself staring into the abyss, wondering how two people could vanish in plain sight, and what truths might be buried in the spaces where their lives once intersected. Lincoln, Nebraska, had always been a city that believed in its own safety, a place where the extraordinary rarely intruded on ordinary lives. When Amber Callahan and Mark Leland disappeared, the news hit like a sudden summer hailstorm, jarring, inexplicable, and impossible to ignore. It started with the frantic calls from their families, echoing into police scanners and local newsrooms, but quickly spilled out onto every street and front porch. In the days that followed, panic set in, wrapping the city in a strange, electrified hush. The local media wasted no time. By Monday morning, headlines screamed from every corner store. Twin disappearance baffles police. Mother and father missing without a trace. Coffee shops buzzed with rumors and speculation. Mothers whispered to one another while ushering their children inside just a little earlier than usual. The faces of Amber and Mark were suddenly everywhere. On TV, taped to windows, printed on stacks of flyers left at gas stations and grocery store counters. The words missing and vanished took on a chilling new gravity. Amber's mother, Janet Callahan, refused to sit still. While police urged patience and protocol, Janet launched her own relentless search. Her days became a blur of desperate activity, calling every friend, every acquaintance, begging them to recall any tiny detail about that Friday night. She led search parties that fanned out into the city's parks and creeks, pushing through tangled brush and weeds in the summer heat. She knocked on doors, pressed flyers into strangers' hands, and phoned news stations until her voice cracked. Each night, Janet returned to her kitchen table to tape fresh posters and highlight new addresses on the map, her hands trembling but determined. Hope and fear warred inside her with every passing hour. She barely slept, pacing the dark living room with her grandson asleep in the next rooms. Haunted by the silence that had replaced Amber's daily check-in calls, she clung to the thought that Amber would never leave her son behind willingly, that some clue, some miracle, would break the nightmare spell and return her daughter home. At every press conference, Janet stood at the front of the crowd, her face pale but fierce, refusing to believe in endings. In the vacuum left by the facts, the internet erupted with wild theories. Online forums speculated about secret affairs and planned escapes, dissecting the grainy security footage from Coffee Haven with the zeal of armchair detectives. Someone claimed they had seen Mark's truck parked near the edge of a wooded area outside Kansas. Another insisted they'd watched Amber buying a bus ticket west, alone and hurried. Each rumor ignited a brief flare of hope, then faded when police followed the leads to dead ends. The community swung between optimism and despair, the rhythm of hope rising and falling with every new report. Meanwhile, the police worked methodically, combing through evidence and retracing every step. Their tone remained cautious in public, careful not to feed the wildfire of rumors, but behind closed doors, frustration mounted. There was no ransom note, no message, no proof of life or death. Every possible theory, kidnapping, voluntary disappearance, tragic accident, seemed to collapse under the weight of too little information. With each fruitless search, the sense of helplessness deepened. But for Janet Callahan, surrender was never an option. She moved through the city like a woman possessed, urging volunteers forward, ignoring the sideways glances and whispered doubts of neighbors. "A mother knows when her child is still out there," she told anyone who would listen. Her conviction a lifeline for others who were beginning to doubt. Her faith kept the search alive long after the headlines faded and the world's attention drifted elsewhere. As July gave way to August, the missing posters began to curl in the heat, their colors bleeding beneath the relentless Nebraska sun. The city's sense of safety had been cracked open, and in the space left behind, unease took root. Families double-checked their locks, strangers eyed each other warily, and old stories about dark things lurking just beyond the edge of the city took on new weight. The world grew smaller for those left behind. Friends of Amber and Mark replayed old memories, wondering if some warning sign had gone unnoticed, some opportunity to intervene missed. In church basements and backyard gatherings, neighbors lit candles and whispered prayers, their faith shaken but unbroken. Every child in Garden Meadows knew the faces on the posters by heart. Every parent found themselves looking over their shoulder, suddenly aware of how thin the walls between safety and loss could be. Still, Janet pressed on. Each evening, as the sun slipped below the rooftops, she taped another flyer to another lamppost and paused beneath the amber streetlights, whispering the same words, soft but certain, into the gathering dark. "I'm not giving up. Amber, wherever you are, I'm not giving up." And as the city held its breath, waiting for answers that refused to come, the mystery of the vanished lovers deepened, pulling Lincoln into a place it had never been, a place where even in plain sight, someone could be lost forever. In the first tense days after Amber and Mark vanished, Lincoln's police department mobilized in ways the city hadn't seen in years. Detectives from across the county were pulled onto the case, each one assembling tiny puzzle pieces into a timeline that grew more baffling with every new detail. From the beginning, the investigation moved with a mix of hope and dread, every step offering a possible answer, every dead end a deeper mystery. Detective Lisa Brenner, veteran of missing persons, became the face of the search. She stood in front of maps plastered with pushpins, each one marking a tip, a sighting, a possible lead. She pored over receipts, phone logs, traffic camera feeds, interviewing everyone who'd crossed paths with Amber and Mark in the hours before they vanished. The process was grueling, relentless, and yielded little that made sense. The timeline was clear, at least on the surface. At 8:50 p.m., Amber left her office, her computer logged off, desk neatly arranged as always. By 9:15, she had arrived at Coffee Haven, confirmed by both security footage and the lone barista who remembered her order, a caramel latte, extra foam. Mark joined her shortly after, sliding into the seat across from her with his familiar, easy smile. For nearly an hour, they talked quietly by the window, bodies leaning closer as the cafe emptied around them. At 9:47, the cameras caught them walking into the parking lot together. The footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, no sign of fear or urgency, no hint of a quarrel. They got into Mark's silver Ford F-150 and drove off into the evening. The next digital breadcrumb came at 10:23 p.m., when Amber's phone pinged a cell tower near Highway 77, just south of Lincoln. After that, all signals went dark. Detectives focused first on the most obvious suspect, Amber's estranged husband. The divorce had been public and painful, and to the outside world, He seemed to have every motive. But neighbors vouched for him. He'd been seen at home all night, hosting a barbecue that stretched into the early hours, a dozen witnesses testifying to his presence. Video from nearby security cameras placed him on his own porch while Amber disappeared into the Nebraska night. With that door closed, the investigation shifted to Mark's movements. His phone records showed a brief stop at a convenience store near Highway 77 just before 10. Surveillance footage from the store captured him buying a bottle of water and a pack of gum, eyes tired but unremarkable, no sign of agitation or distress. The clerk remembered him, said he seemed distracted but polite. That was the last confirmed sighting of either Amber or Mark. After 10:23 p.m., it was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Mark's bank account remained untouched. Amber's credit cards gathered dust. There were no withdrawals, no gas station purchases, no hotel check-ins, no calls from distant area codes. Not a single camera, ATM, or license plate reader in a 100-mile radius registered their faces or vehicles. Police released appeals to the public, set up hotlines, and even enlisted the help of the FBI. But every day, the leads grew colder. Detective Brenner sat in her office late into the night, scrolling through the last text messages Amber sent. "I'm going to talk to Mark tonight. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." The words were maddeningly vague. Had Amber planned to leave? Had she confided a fear? Every possible theory, an accident, a planned escape, an abduction, was weighed and reweighed, but none fit cleanly with the evidence or the absence of it. The pressure on law enforcement mounted as the case dominated local headlines. News crews camped outside police headquarters, hungry for any detail, any hint of breakthrough. Detectives returned again and again to the beginning, searching for a clue they might have missed. At one point, dogs were brought to the stretch of highway where the phones went silent, but nothing turned up. Divers searched ponds and creeks. Search teams combed the surrounding woods. The only thing found was emptiness. The families, meanwhile, waited in a limbo that felt both endless and surreal. Janet Callahan called the precinct every morning, her questions turning more desperate as the days ticked by. Mark's wife, living apart from him, faced a different kind of agony. Her children's questions, the sideways glances of neighbors, the weight of not knowing whether to grieve or hope. Amber's abandoned Toyota Corolla became a sad landmark in the Walmart parking lot, its windows accumulating dust as police officers returned again and again to search for overlooked evidence. Each time, they found the same things: a purse, a set of keys, a phone without new messages. It was a scene that mocked the promise of closure. By the end of summer, the investigation had reached a kind of exhausted stasis. The detectives still followed up on every tip, still met weekly in the cramped squad room, but optimism was fading. No ransom demand appeared. No anonymous letter arrived. No body was found to draw a cruel line under the story. There was only a void, an absence that grew larger every day as the city waited, watched, and wondered if Amber and Mark had left of their own will, or if something darker had claimed them beneath the Nebraska stars. The city's breathless anticipation slowly turned to aching silence. As weeks bled into months, the faces of Amber Callahan and Mark Leland faded from television screens, replaced by new headlines and more immediate concerns. Yet for their families and those who clung to hope, the disappearance left a wound that refused to heal. The rhythm of daily life resumed in Lincoln, but beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered, as if the ground itself remembered what the world wanted to forget. By December 2013, the investigation had exhausted itself against the brick wall of uncertainty. Detectives packed up boxes of evidence, phone records, maps, hundreds of interviews, labeling them cold case and shelving them alongside other unsolved mysteries. The files grew dusty, their contents disturbed only when a new tip or a reporter's question briefly flickered the case back to life. In those moments, hope surged, then dissipated just as quickly when nothing new materialized. Volunteers did not give up so easily. Throughout the rest of 2013 and well into 2014, search parties still gathered in church basements and grocery store parking lots, their resolve worn thin but unbroken. They fanned out along the muddy banks of Salt Creek, combed through dense forest groves and the ruins of abandoned quarries outside town, following any clue no matter how far-fetched. Some swore they glimpsed tire tracks or found scraps of clothing. Each discovery was examined, catalogued, and ultimately dismissed. The missing lovers remained stubbornly absent, their lives frozen in time. Hundreds of anonymous tips poured in as the story spread beyond Nebraska. The internet, hungry for answers, buzzed with rumors and wild theories. "I saw them in Colorado," one caller insisted. "They're living under new names in Kansas," claimed another. Some tips came from people genuinely convinced they had spotted Amber and Mark in diners or convenience stores far from home. Others felt more like cruel jokes, designed to provoke a flicker of false hope. Each tip was methodically checked, investigators driving for hours across state lines, only to return empty-handed and defeated. In 2015, a small glimmer broke through the monotony. A gas station clerk in rural Idaho called the Lincoln police, his voice nervous but insistent. He claimed he'd seen a woman who matched Amber's description. Same brown hair, same wary eyes, the faintest trace of a Nebraska accent when she spoke. Detective Brenner, still haunted by the case even after it had slipped from the front page, requested the surveillance footage. The video arrived days later, grainy and gray, the figures nearly indistinguishable. She played it over and over, searching for familiar gestures or expressions, but uncertainty reigned. The footage was sent to Amber's family, who sat in their living room, hearts pounding as they pressed their faces to the screen, hoping for a miracle. The verdict was heartbreakingly inconclusive. It could have been her, but it could have been anyone. Years rolled by, slow and heavy. Amber's son grew older, asking fewer questions but still glancing at the door on birthdays and holidays, searching for a mother's shadow. Mark's family moved out of state, seeking distance from a past that clung too tightly. Detective Brenner transferred to a different unit, but never forgot the case. The neat rows of evidence, the feeling of something vital always just out of reach. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by her window with old case files, turning over facts like stones, hoping that the passage of time might loosen the truth. Through it all, Janet Callahan kept vigil. Every July 21st, she lit a candle in the front window of her modest home, her movements slow and deliberate. The small flame flickered against the glass, a silent beacon calling Amber home. Each year she whispered the same prayer, part plea, part promise, not to let her daughter slip into the oblivion of the forgotten. She wrote letters to newspapers and local officials, urging them how to let the story die, not to let her child's memory fade beneath the weight of new tragedies. Some nights Janet would dream of Amber, dreams so real she could smell her shampoo, feel the brush of her hand. In those moments, the ache of absence softened, replaced by the fleeting comfort of hope. But each morning, reality returned, as relentless as the Nebraska wind. The world had moved on, but she could not. The city, too, wore its scars. The apartment where Amber once lived was rented to a new tenant, the walls scrubbed clean, the last traces of her life erased. Coffee Haven, where Amber and Mark had last been seen together, changed ownership, repainted and refurnished. Only those who remembered felt the ghost of that summer linger, the sense that, just for a moment, two lives had slipped through the cracks of the everyday and vanished into legend. For everyone touched by the mystery, the question remained: how could two people simply disappear? As the years passed, the question deepened, hollow and unsatisfied, echoing across the cornfields and empty highways. And still, each July, Janet's candle burned in the window, a silent promise that the search for answers would never truly end. 8 years had slipped by since that humid summer night, when Amber Callahan and Mark Leland seemed to dissolve into thin air. For most, the story had become a cautionary tale, something to whisper about over coffee, a riddle that even time couldn't solve. But for Janet Callahan and the families left behind, the pain never dulled, only changed shape. Lincoln had healed on the surface, but the wound beneath remained raw. The missing posters were long gone, their colors faded by sun and rain. But in quiet houses across the city, memories still flickered in the shadows. Then, in April 2020, the ordinary spun suddenly into the extraordinary. It began in a drab government office, buried deep in the heart of the state capitol, where a young investigator named Evan Rhodes stared at a computer screen that glowed with possibility. The Nebraska Cold Case Review Unit had just acquired access to a powerful new federal database, one that could cross-reference IDs, driver's licenses, and facial features with unprecedented accuracy. Rhodes, known for his persistence and his knack for seeing patterns where others saw only static, reopened the file out of a sense of duty and a hint of hope. He started at the beginning, sifting through every detail that had been collected over nearly a decade. He studied the grainy security footage from Coffee Haven, the traffic cam snapshots, the pitifully short list of credit card transactions, the blurry gas station tape from Idaho. Late one evening, as a thunderstorm rattled the windows and the world outside blurred to water and neon, Rhodes fed Amber's old photograph into the database. Just another desperate attempt, he thought, in a long line of them. The results returned faster than he expected. His eyes narrowed as the screen filled with faces, names, and scores. There, among hundreds of distant lookalikes, was a near-perfect match. A woman named Claire Rains, born 1985, living in a speck of a town in rural Idaho. Her facial recognition score was 98%. The hair was darker now, the jaw a touch softer, but the eyes, those unmistakable eyes, were Amber's. Rhodes's heart thudded as he dug further. Claire Rains, the record said, ran a small auto repair shop with her husband. The man's name was Michael Landor, listed as 6'1", blue eyes, once registered in Nebraska as Mark Leland. Facial recognition tagged him at 99%. It was almost impossible. And yet, the more Rhodes read, the more the impossible seemed true. He followed procedure. He brought the information to his supervisor, then to the Idaho police, and soon a small caravan of unmarked cars rolled quietly down a gravel road on the edge of a mountain valley. The repair shop stood at the end of the lane, flanked by fields and the distant line of pine trees. Wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, and the scent of oil and sun-warmed grass hung heavy in the air. Inside, life went on as if nothing in the world was wrong. Claire, Amber, worked behind the counter, sorting invoices. Michael, Mark, bent under the hood of a battered pickup, his hands stained with grease. They looked up as officers entered, the years etched into their faces, but the shock unmistakable. There was no resistance, no flight, only a stunned silence as the truth came into the light. In the hours that followed, the mystery that had gripped Lincoln unraveled in whispers and gasps. There was no crime, no violence, no dark secret, except the one they'd carried together. A choice to vanish, to shed the weight of their past lives, to become someone else in a place no one would think to look. They hadn't run out of fear. They'd run out of longing, a hunger for freedom so deep it had swallowed every obligation and regret. The news rocketed through Nebraska and beyond. The city that had mourned Amber and Mark now struggled to understand. Some called it a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of reinvention and the courage to seize happiness at any cost. Others saw it as an act of betrayal, an abandonment too selfish to forgive, a wound reopened by the knowledge that those left behind had been chosen for loss. As the Idaho sun set behind the mountains, Amber and Mark, now Claire and Michael, sat together on the steps of their shop, watching as the world they'd built trembled under the weight of discovery. For them, there were no grand explanations, no rehearsed statements. They had simply walked away, side by side, into the wild unknown, believing that love could erase the pain they'd left behind. But the truth, once found, could never be hidden again. In that moment, two lives, long lost to the world, were finally and irrevocably returned, not to the past, but to the inescapable present, where the consequences of their disappearance would ripple outward, touching everyone who had ever searched, wondered, or grieved. The news that Amber Callahan and Mark Leland were alive spread across Lincoln with the force of a prairie windstorm. It blew through neighborhoods and church halls, rattled the windows of old friends, and stung the hearts of those who had clung to hope or grief for so long. In an instant, the narrative shifted. No longer a tragic cold case, but a story of escape, of love, perhaps, but also of abandonment and the impossibility of perfect closure. Television trucks lined up outside Janet Callahan's modest home before dawn, cameras waiting to capture her reaction. For years, Janet had kept Amber's room just as she'd left it, a museum of faded photographs, gently folded clothes, and childhood keepsakes lined up with loving precision. The world wanted to witness her joy, but what they found was something more complicated. News anchors struggled to make sense of Janet's tears. They were not the tears of reunion, but of an old wound torn open once more. The ache of a mother who realized that her daughter's absence had not been a tragedy, but a choice. Inside her living room, Janet clutched a photograph of Amber and her grandson and listened to the voices from the television. Reporters reciting the details as if they alone could smooth over the years of pain. There was pride in Amber's resilience, but the shock of being left behind settled over Janet's shoulders like a winter frost. She watched clips of Amber, now Claire, on surveillance cameras in Idaho, living a life that was ordinary in its own quiet way, running a business, laughing with her new neighbors. Janet's thoughts tangled together. Relief, sorrow, anger, and a sense of betrayal that no one else could truly understand. The city of Lincoln split in its response. Some people called the story romantic, even brave, a testament to the human desire for reinvention, for the pursuit of happiness on one's own terms. They wondered aloud about the courage it took to abandon an entire life, to start over as someone new. Others saw the act as selfishness in its purest form, a cruelty that left scars on everyone who had once cared for Amber and Mark. In bars and beauty salons, arguments simmered, each side clinging to their version of the truth. At the police station, Detective Lisa Brenner stared at the closed file with a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. She had spent years chasing shadows and doubts, haunted by the image of Amber's abandoned car and the silent fields beyond the city. Now the answer was simple and crushing. Two people had simply walked away. The case was officially closed, stamped with a word that brought little comfort to anyone involved: voluntary disappearance. There would be no trial, no final accounting, no chance for the city to demand answers to the questions that had gnawed at it for so long. Mark's family, living now in another state, greeted the news with muted disbelief. Their grief had been private and complicated, burdened by unfinished business and the ache of unresolved love. When reporters called, they hung up the phone. In their hearts, forgiveness and understanding wrestled with a lingering sense of abandonment. The knowledge that Mark had chosen freedom over reconciliation, distance over repair. Amber's son, older now, a teenager with a guarded smile and thoughtful eyes, sat on the edge of his bed, listening to his grandmother try to explain. He stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the mother he remembered with the woman he saw in grainy news footage. For years he had imagined every possibility: tragedy, adventure, even miracles. The truth was more ordinary and more painful than any of them. As for Amber and Mark, Claire and Michael, they issued a brief statement through a lawyer, asking for privacy. They did not return to Nebraska, did not grant interviews or stand before the cameras to explain themselves. They continued their lives in Idaho, keeping their circle small, tending to their business and the routines they had built from the ashes of their pasts. In their small town, the story faded quickly. The locals, more interested in weather and harvests than old mysteries, let them blend quietly into the background. For Lincoln, closure was elusive. The story had ended, but the questions lingered. What drove two people to erase themselves from their own lives? Was it an act of courage or cowardice? Could a city ever truly recover from a loss that turned out not to be a loss at all, but a deliberate vanishing act? Those who had searched, prayed, and waited felt the absence in a new way, less like mourning, more like the slow, confusing process of letting go. Janet Callahan lit her candle one final time on July 21st, not out of hope but out of ritual, a way to honor the daughter she had lost to time, distance, and the choices no one could change. As the flame danced in the window, she whispered her familiar prayer, the words now transformed, not for a return, but for peace, for forgiveness, for the strength to live with answers that never truly satisfy. And so, in Lincoln and in Idaho, the story settled into history, a tale of love and disappearance, of wounds that healed unevenly, and of the impossible, enduring hope that sometimes the ones who vanish will find their way home, even if only in memory. The story of Amber Callahan and Mark Leland lingered over Lincoln for years, a haunting modern legend that reshaped the city's understanding of absence, love, and what it means to start again. But for those who dug deeper, the echoes of the past revealed themselves, threads reaching back nearly half a century to another time, another pair of vanished lovers, and a mystery that had long since passed into Nebraska folklore. Beneath the surface of Amber and Mark's disappearance lay the shadow of a real case, as unsettling as it was baffling. In 1965, on the outskirts of a small Nebraska town not so different from Lincoln, Jacqueline Ann Rains Crackman and Melvin Uphoff vanished without warning. The similarities were striking. Two adults, each entangled in difficult marriages, each carrying secret burdens, each stepping out of their known lives into a void that left their families bewildered and their communities grasping for explanations. The story had started innocently enough. Jacqueline and Melvin met by chance, drawn together by shared struggles and the quiet understanding that comes only from the weary. Friends would later recall the way their laughter lingered after church picnics, the gentle hush that fell over the room when the two of them sat together. There were whispers, of course, as there always are in small towns, hints of longing, restlessness, and an invisible line neither dared cross until one day they simply did. Their disappearance unfolded in eerie parallel to Amber and Mark's. Jacqueline's car was discovered parked outside a local grocery store, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. Melvin's belongings were likewise found abandoned, as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. There were no calls for help, no frantic messages, only a silence that stretched into days, then weeks, then years. As with Amber and Mark, the investigation stretched on for decades. Detectives followed every lead, chasing rumors across state lines and through the shifting sands of memory. There were reported sightings from Colorado to Oklahoma, mysterious postcards that arrived with no return address, and countless tips that ended in disappointment. The families, like Janet Callahan decades later, lived with uncertainty so deep it became a second skin, a wound that never closed, even as life pressed onward. In 2009, nearly 44 years after Jacqueline and Melvin had vanished, the impossible happened. A routine record search in a distant state uncovered two names, Ann Miller and Jim Carson. Both lived in a quiet community in the Pacific Northwest. Both worked ordinary jobs. Both kept to themselves. What caught the eye of investigators was more than a passing resemblance. It was the kind of match that made hearts skip and minds race. A few phone calls, a fingerprint check, and the mystery that had shadowed Nebraska for generations finally broke open. The truth stunned everyone. Jacqueline and Melvin, Ann and Jim, had been alive all along, living quietly under new identities. They had not been victims of foul play, nor had they stumbled into tragedy. Like Amber and Mark, they had made a choice: to slip out of their old skins, to vanish from a world that felt too heavy, to build a new life out of reach of old pain and old expectations. They had married, found work, blended into the patchwork of their adopted town, as if they had always belonged. For Nebraska, the revelation was both closure and upheaval. Some greeted the news with relief, others with anger or disbelief. The decades of searching, grieving, and questioning were suddenly reframed, not as a search for the lost, but as a lesson in the power and cost of disappearance. The newspapers called it one of the most baffling cold cases ever solved. For the families left behind, answers did not erase the ache, but at least brought the story's shadow to an end. The legend of Jacqueline and Melvin, now retold in the story of Amber and Mark, became a kind of mirror, a way for people to examine the mysteries inside their own lives. How many among us have dreamed, if only for a moment, of walking away from what we know? How often do we imagine that a new name, a new town, might be the answer to wounds that refuse to heal? Yet in the retelling, the lesson shifts. Every vanishing leaves an afterimage, a constellation of sorrow, questions, and memories that endure long after the missing are found. In the end, fiction and reality fold together. Amber and Mark's story, though imagined, is built from the true heartbreak and strange resolution of Jacqueline and Melvin. Both remind us that disappearance is never as clean as a closed door or a faded photograph. It is a living absence, shaped by longing and regret, by hope and fear, and by the countless unseen ties that bind one life to another. As the people of Lincoln learned, and as those who remembered Jacqueline and Melvin would always know, sometimes the stories we tell to understand loss are the same ones that teach us about forgiveness, change, and the complex price of freedom. Time has a way of softening the edges of pain, blurring the lines between what was lost and what was left behind. In Lincoln, years passed, seasons turning the city's parks from green to gold. The old wounds of Amber Callahan and Mark Leland's disappearance healing over in places, aching anew in others. The story was no longer front-page news, but it lived on in quiet rituals, in memory, in the gentle acts of remembrance that defy forgetting. Every July 21st, Janet Callahan still lit a candle in her front window. She did not do it for news crews, or even for Amber anymore. She did it for herself, and for all the mothers who waited for doors to open, for the return of a voice on the other end of the phone. The small flame glowed against the dark, a private memorial that reached beyond words. Sometimes neighbors would notice and pause, remembering the summer when the whole city searched, hearts joined in hope and dread. Most, however, simply moved on, letting the story fade into the long, complicated history of their hometown. But some stories refused to vanish. In the quiet corners of Lincoln, inside libraries where missing posters once hung, in church pews and crowded barbershops, the tale of the lovers who vanished in plain sight lingered, a lesson etched into the collective heart of the city. Teachers whispered it to curious students, parents invoked it on sleepless nights, and strangers who barely knew Amber or Mark felt the weight of what had happened, the way a mystery can nestle inside a place and never quite let go. Time can erase footprints, but not the ache of longing, not the questions left behind by those who disappear. For Janet and the families that lost them, closure proved elusive. There were days when forgiveness felt impossible, when anger and confusion surged with the certainty that some wounds never truly heal. And yet, in the quiet hours, acceptance began to grow, not as surrender, but as an act of courage. To love someone is to accept the possibility of loss, and to remember is to honor all the lives entwined with our own, even when those threads are cut by time, by choice, or by fate. The story of Amber and Mark, like the real-life vanishing of Jacqueline and Melvin before them, left behind a message more complicated than any simple moral. Their escape was not an act of malice, nor was it a solution to suffering. Freedom, they discovered, always comes at a cost. The burdens they carried in Lincoln were not simply left behind in the Nebraska dust. They traveled with them, invisible but inescapable, reshaping their new lives even as they tried to begin again. If this story teaches anything, it is that running away from pain does not heal it. The ache of being trapped, by circumstance, by fear, by the expectations of others, cannot be truly outrun. Real freedom is found not in vanishing, but in facing the truth of our lives, in seeking help, in speaking honestly with those who love us and who we leave behind. The longing for a new beginning is universal, but the way forward must be built on truth, on forgiveness, and on the courage to face what is broken, not simply to flee from it. As years passed, Lincoln changed in small ways. Families who had once left doors unlocked now turned keys and checked windows before bed. Children asked harder questions, and parents learned to listen more carefully, to cherish each moment of connection. The story of the vanished lovers became a call not just to remember, but to act, to reach out to those who are struggling, to notice when someone disappears behind a mask of routine, to offer compassion where there might be only silence. If you are reading or listening, and you carry your own pain, the story is for you too. Do not vanish quietly. Speak up. Reach for help. Tell your story before it becomes a legend others try to explain. The world is full of people who care, who want to keep you from slipping through the cracks. And if you believe every story deserves justice, every person deserves to be remembered, then carry these names: Amber Callahan, Mark Leland, Jacqueline Rains-Crackman, Melvin Uphoff, with you. Let their stories be a reminder. The truth is always worth seeking, no matter how long the search or how cold the trail. Share these stories, keep their memories alive, and become part of the chorus that refuses to let anyone vanish without a trace. Because sometimes, the only thing more powerful than vanishing is being found. Sometimes, only the truth can set you free. So if you've followed this story, if you've felt its echoes, don't let it end here. Tell it again. Share it with a friend, a neighbor, a stranger who might need to know that they're not alone. Subscribe, tap the bell, become a witness, so that one cold case at a time, we can bring a little more light to the places where the shadows once ruled.